All right, everybody. Good morning. It's still a little bit early before the first few minutes of class, but anyway, welcome to all, anyone watching live or later in time. About 7 minutes till class time, so this is just a little free moment of time as we wait for the clock to change. But hopefully you guys are doing well and ready to take in another little lesson on philosophy of religion. Good morning, Megan. Good to see you. Guess for now it's just us, but nice to have an early start. Hope things are going smooth so far today. Oh, hey, Peachy. Peach. Well, it's been good. Just a lot of classes to teach, but so far, it's early in the semester, so I don't have a lot of papers to grade yet, so that's nice. But yeah, it's been pretty good. The fire has been not nice. It's kind of like limited my outdoor running activities a little bit because of the air quality, but it's not too bad here in Long Beach. But yeah, it's been pretty chill. Eddie. The cats are just running around over here. Cool. Yeah, I have some friends and relatives that are a little more up in the northern part of California, but nobody who's been like directly, like seriously impacted by the fire. But it's definitely it's a rough fire season. A lot of damage, and we're just gonna have to, I guess, hopefully in the future get the climate under control. That'd be the best. That's the thing. Yeah. Okay. Just about 3 or 4 minutes to go. Eddie, you would laugh if you saw stuff Eddie's doing on the ground, rolling on the floor. Really funny guy. Yeah. Eddie, you wanna come here? Eddie, here. Let's see, can I actually get the camera to point at him? You see what's going on. Just laying flat back, belly up, rolling around, Eddie, what are you thinking? Whatever, yeah. Yeah, he's pretty awesome kitty. Big boy. What's up, Eddie? few more minutes. Welcome everybody showing up. Good to see you guys. Anybody can feel free to say hello or good morning or anything. Good morning, Kylie. All the rest. Good morning, Kelly. Good to see you too. Okay. All right, guys. Well, I mean, it's more or less 9 a.m. right now, so I'll get us going. Thanks again for your attendance this morning. I appreciate it. Basically, today we just continue through the syllabus. Hopefully we can get on track, but I'm sure that by the end of Monday's meeting, since that's kind of a light day on the schedule, we'll definitely be all caught up. So right now we're working through all of the topics on the philosophy of religion. And we've been covering different arguments for the existence of God and then some criticisms and objections that have been given to those. The first main argument was the ontological argument, which is all about, the definition of God being the greatest conceivable being, and then tracing that definition to the conclusion that he must exist, because I guess the argument states that it's greater to really exist in both mind and reality than just the mind. So based on the definition, he must exist in both. We heard the objections: Galileo, Lost Island, Moore, existence not a predicate, Rowe. You can't just define something as existing and then think you've proven it. And then after all that, we started to talk about this second argument for God's existence last time. So I want to kind of start by having a little more of a detailed review of the cosmological argument, which we pretty much got through. To summarize that, cap that off, and then we'll talk about the work of Ernest Nagel. Nagel writes the paper, Does God Exist?, which criticizes these various arguments and tries to find fault and what the problems could be with them. And then there's also William Paley. So those are the two main things, William Paley and Ernest Nagel. If we can get over through most of those, that'll be great. Good morning, everybody, and to everyone here. It's always nice to see you guys in the chat, so I appreciate that. Drew, Lucy, and everyone else we've seen here so far, so feel free to say hi, or of course at any point, break in with a question or a comment or anything else if you need me to clarify. And hi, Lily. So cosmological argument. Let's just go over this one time. So it starts off, remember, with the example of a man or woman, whoever, who's walking through the woods. Suppose that someone's walking through the woods and then they encounter a unusual sight. Like we're saying, suppose the person stumbled on a big sphere that's sitting there in the woods. Now, since it's such a weird thing pretty much for it to be in the woods, it would probably cause you to think things like, why is that there? Or how did that get there? What's the cause of that thing? So this basically is an illustration then of the principle of sufficient reasoning. So what is that principle? The principle says that in case there's something that's true, there must have been a cause or an explanation, some sufficient reason for it. Because whenever something exists, it can't exist on its own. It has to be caused by something that brought it into being. And that's obviously true of us, of objects every day that we see around us. Everything has a beginning. So if it exists, it had to have some cause. That's the point of the whole sphere example, as weird as the example is. But he says, I only use this strange example because It's only when something's out of place that you think those thoughts. Why is that there? What caused that to be there? But you could think the same thought about anything. So he gives you a lead in with something where that feeling or reaction is more normal to have. But then he mentions that that same kind of question or inquiry could actually be given about anything. Because of course anything, not just the sphere, but anything at all, is something that must have had a cause. Okay, so we are then told about the contingent and necessary truths. So contingent truths, if you guys can remember, are the sort of truths that are true, but they could have been false. Like here you are watching this lecture, which I'm happy to know that you are watching. But if you had overslept, or if you had, I don't know, had a different schedule today or different plans, then you easily could have not been watching this lecture. So the fact you're watching it is a contingent truth. The fact that you were even born is a contingent truth, and not just me and you, but like objects and events all around us. The outcome of World War II, the outcome of a presidential election, or you know, an NBA game or an NFL game. These different things are all matters of contingent truth, and therefore, according to the principle of sufficient reason, they have to have a cause. Now, the other kind of truth is necessary truth. Those are things that are true, but they cannot possibly be false. So you would think of things like mathematics or geometry or whatever. So then the next point in the argument is to mention that the universe exists. Clearly the universe exists. And it's argued in the cosmological argument that it's a contingent fact that the universe exists. Because, you know, every part of the universe, every event and object within the universe is contingent. So why wouldn't the whole thing be? So his argument then is that this universe is contingent, right? And if the principle of sufficient reason is accurate, that means that there must be a cause for the universe. And that's kind of where we had left off, I think, at the end. But these additional remarks we kind of gestured at or talked about in brief. Let me just kind of expand on them a bit. So say that this circle here that I'm drawing with the letter U in it represents the universe. So now we've gotten to the point in the argument where the question is, what could be the cause of the universe? Because it seems to be contingent. And it seems that everything that's contingent has a cause. So what could be the cause of this thing? Not just some specific thing, but everything, the whole totality of space and time, the whole cosmos, the whole universe. Could the universe cause itself? Could this be the case? Like something that's part of the universe or the universe itself causes its own existence. And this is, of course, not possible. A thing cannot be its own cause. Because, of course, in order to cause anything, the thing has to already exist. So for something to cause itself, it's a breakdown in logic. It's like saying the thing already exists and then it causes itself to exist. If it already existed, then it wouldn't need to cause itself. So it's incoherent and absurd to say that it's a self-caused thing. Think of a person giving birth to themselves. You can't think of that. That does not make sense because they would have already had to exist before the birth. So individual for the universe to its own cause, as long as it's contingent. And then another thing is question, well, could the cause of the universe not be itself? Seems like it's got to be something different from it. But if it's something different from the universe, could it be something contingent that causes it? So this little arrow, just pretend the arrow stands for cause and effect. This thing is the cause, and this is the effect that it's pointing to, which is the universe. But suppose that the cause of the universe up here, the letter C, is something that is contingent. If that's contingent, then just like the universe, it has to have a cause also. And then we're asking about what caused the cause of the universe. And that just leads us back and back and back to an infinite regress, as it is called. So if there's just contingencies on contingencies, that goes on infinitely, and that is thought to be absurd in the judgment of those who use the argument. So like an actually infinite sequence of events is impossible. How could there be an infinite sequence with no beginning? That doesn't give any explanation as to why the whole sequence exists in the first place. So the principle is stated that an infinite regress is impossible, an infinite regress of causes. So if that's not possible, if it can't just be another cause, another cause, another cause going back forever, that means that there has to be an initial cause, something that starts the whole sequence, that's the beginning, that's the foundation, and nothing behind it. And that, according to the logic of the argument, has to be a necessary being. That's why I'm labeling it with the letter N. N, the necessary being, is the cause of the universe and everything within it. So God, thought of as this necessary being that's not contingent, could serve as the explanation for what causes the universe. And as the argument goes, there's nothing else that could explain this universe. If you say that some other finite contingent being that depends on something else is the cause of the universe, that just pushes the question back another level. So if there's something that is contingent on other things that caused our universe, then there must be a cause of it. And this will lead us nowhere towards ultimate origins if we just keep stacking contingent things on contingent things to explain the next link in the causal sequence. So since there must be an ultimate origin to the whole sequence of causes, it must be something that is not itself contingent. That means that it must be a necessary being. And so God is that necessary being, a being that's not contingent, a being that doesn't depend on anything or anyone for its existence, but everything else depends on him. So the universe and all of us and everything within it would not exist if not for the necessary being, but the necessary being exists on its own, independent of all other things. So, that's the argument basically. And just one last very brief summary. Everything's got to have a cause. That's the principle of sufficient reason. The universe is a thing, so it has to have a cause. But whatever caused it can't be something contingent, because that would lead to an infinite regress, which is claimed to be impossible. So the only possible cause of the universe must be a contingent thing, a necessary thing. And that is generally just conceived of as God. And notice that this argument doesn't try to establish more specific details about what God is like or what his message is for us or how we're supposed to live. So it doesn't say, for example, it must be that you follow the doctrines of Christianity or Judaism or Islam. It just says there must be a creator God. Otherwise, the universe wouldn't exist, but clearly it does, and so that's the only explanation of it. And then I guess once the established argument of God's existence is given, then a person is obviously free to follow whatever doctrines of religion that they think most accurately describe this necessary being. But notice that it's just an argument for God's existence. It's not particular to one or another conception of the creator. Okay, so hopefully is that okay? Hopefully that makes some sense. I just wanted to round off and kind of finalize our discussion of that. We'll come back to it, as we discuss the objections and things that follow on later. But that's my last few words for the moment on the cosmological argument. Now, we're just surveying these very important classical arguments for God's existence. We've looked now at two, the ontological and the cosmological. There's another very kind of powerful argument for God's existence that's also usually mentioned in these kinds of discussions, and that is the argument from design. So we're going to talk about that one now. Okay, so the argument from design, just open my notes a little here. So there's a lot of different versions of this argument, but we're looking at one version of it that was written in the year 1800 by this man. So the author's name is William Paley. And he lived from the time of 1743 until 1805. He was basically a British philosopher and a priest, so he was both an academic and a theologian. And in 1800, he wrote this book that contains a version of the argument that we're looking at here, the argument from design. So these are the dates of his life. This is the argument and essay that we're discussing of his, and this is when he wrote this particular piece. So the argument from design, let's see how it works. Once again, the author, in this case, making his argument that God exists, uses a hypothetical scenario to start off the whole discussion. So a common tactic, as I've mentioned before in philosophy, is to present a hypothetical scenario in order to fix your mind on certain ideas or concepts. Like in the case of Gamilo, he said, imagine that there were a lost island greater than anything else you could conceive of. In Taylor's article, he says, imagine you were in the woods, you came across a sphere. That's used to try and present the principle of sufficient reason to you. Well, this author has another hypothetical scenario to get the whole discussion started, and ironically enough, coincidentally, it also involves a person walking through the woods. So we're back to the woods. You're walking around the woods, imagine that, and so the way he puts it is like you start off and say you just see like a rock sitting on the forest floor. You probably wouldn't bat an eye at that. You'd just be like, well, that's a rock. It's something that belongs in the forest. Maybe it's been there forever. Maybe the forest has been there forever. I don't know. But he said if you came across something else, you couldn't give the same response. And what he says is, suppose that you came across a watch on the forest floor, you know, like a watch like I'm wearing on my wrist. If you ever came across a watch in a forest or just anywhere really, but if you came across one, what's something that you would know for sure about the origins of the watch? Like, what's the only sort of thing that can ultimately be responsible for the creation of a watch? How could a watch ever come to exist? He says it's something that we all recognize pretty immediately, that it was human-made. Yeah, Eva, that it was something that had to be made by an intelligent creature. You know, what is it about a watch that's different from, like, I don't know, a random rock or something, that when you see it, it's just immediately clear that this is something that had to be created by a mind with intelligence? Why is it something that we know for sure had to have come from an intelligent creator or an intelligent designer? What is it about a watch that makes that seem so obvious, perhaps? So you say it involves the concept of time, right? And you can argue that anything that's even involved with the measurement and the recording of time would have to be crafted by a being that wants to assemble it for that purpose. And then, Megan, I like what you've said. It has several moving parts, right? So all the little parts of the watch have to be just so delicately assembled in order for it to produce the function of timekeeping. Drew, you say mechanism, and that's also very good. You know, the watch functions to tell time, and so it's got to be put together by some type of being that knows how to frame the parts and adjust them for that purpose. So you guys are all, I think, hitting on the right idea, that it's complex, that it has an intricate inner working of parts, and that it can produce the function of telling time. So Paley agrees. He says, we know the watch had to come from an intelligent creator, and the basic reason is because it is something that has a purpose or a function, and it has this internal complexity of parts. So I'll put that here. The principle, therefore, that derives from the example. You know, the example is given, but there's like some like moral to the story, as you could say, or a purpose, like a watch. Then it has to have an intelligent creator. So there's the watch example, and then take-home point is just that if a thing has a purpose or function, then it had to have an intelligent designer. All right. So, you know, if you've read the article, you know, you already, I think, will have a basic sense of how this develops from here. Even if you haven't read it and, you know, you're following the discussion, maybe you are getting the outline anyway in your mind of where this is going to ultimately go. Keep in mind the big picture. He's going to try and make the case that God exists. And we're starting the discussion with this observation that a thing like a watch or any other such thing that has a function or purpose and careful assembly of parts would have to be something made by an intelligent designer. Now, why does he use the case of the watch? Well, keep in mind, it's 1800 when this was written. So back then, you know, we had some fancy and impressive items of human industry, but a watch would be something that people then would have understood and recognized as, you know, a carefully assembled mechanism made for telling time. Today, we would have perhaps a much bigger menu of options to use for the example. I could say, oh, you find a cell phone, somewhere on the ground. Now, a cell phone with the ability that it has to, web browse, place phone calls, take photos and all that is obviously also something that couldn't have just come about except for an intelligent designer. The computer or device that you're watching this on could be another example. An automobile, the internal combustion engine of the automobile, which allows it to produce locomotion, that's something that couldn't exist if there weren't an intelligent designer to create it. Rocket ships, televisions, so these glasses, anything that conduces to perform a function or purpose and has parts that are just carefully assembled for that purpose would seem to fit the same kind of format of his argument. Okay, so it didn't need to be a watch example, but that's what the author's example was to make this point. Now let me read a bit here, and you can see what he said in the actual essay. And remember, it's a little of that old-fashioned English prose because it's written in 1800. But he says, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. Now about the stone, he says, I might possibly answer that for all I know, to the contrary, it has lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer, but suppose that I found a watch upon the ground, and I was asked how the watch happened to be in that place. I would hardly think of the answer that I gave before, that for all I know it was always there, but why wouldn't this answer work for the watch as well as for the stone? For this reason, and for none other, namely that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we don't see in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, or of a different size from what they are, or put together in any other manner than the one they are in, then no motion would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. And then he goes over some of the little details of how watches actually, function and work. So given that, the principle, he believes, has been advanced, that when something has got a purpose or function, e.g., example given, a watch, then it must have had an intelligent creator. Okay, now the next part of his discussion is where he actually talks about how there are a host of factors that they would not cause you to doubt or deny that the watch had a maker. So I just want to briefly touch on these points that he makes that are on page 32 and 33. He has 8 Roman numerals listed there, and these are like 8 different factors or things that would not cause you or me or anybody to doubt that the watch has a maker. So I'm going to help you through that part because I know it could seem a little confusing, but once we clarify it, I think it'll be crystal clear. So factors that would not cause one to doubt that the watch had a maker. Okay, so now I say that there's 8 of these points mentioned in the text, and there are, but I'm just going to go over like the ones that I thought were the most important and essential. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 of them off of those 8. One of the factors that he mentions, the first one, is suppose that you've never seen a watch being made yourself. You have never seen a watch being made. Okay, so let's focus on this point for a moment. Now, me personally, speaking for my own sake, I've never actually seen a watch being put together or made. I have a watch on. I have several watches that I own. But, despite that, I've never watched the actual assembly process of a watch with my own eyes. And probably many of you have not either. I think for most of us, we just own or buy watches or see them. But it would take like a special effort for you to go out and, I don't know, watch on the internet like how it's made and see the assembly line process or the, the workshop process of the watchmaker doing his craft. Most of us probably have not actually witnessed or seen that. So suppose that you've not seen a watch being made, okay? If you have not, would that be a real legitimate reason to doubt that it had a maker, yes or no? So suppose you have not seen a watch being made. Would that make you say, hey, I don't know if they actually have a maker, because me, I've never seen anyone make it. So I can't tell if it has a maker until I actually see it being made. Don't you agree that you don't really need to see it being made yourself to understand that it has a maker? Right? Do you follow me? Like, so not having seen the watch being made, does that really cause you to doubt that it has a maker? Let me get your feedback on the question. So just type in your thoughts on this. Does one have to see the watch made themselves to have confidence that it has a maker? Or even if you haven't seen one being made? Good, Eva, right. So you're answering in the negative because the way I phrased the question was, would this give you a reason to doubt? And you're right, again, that it's just intuitive that it had to have a maker. You know that it was made by somebody, even in the absence of having witnessed the creation of them. Why is he mentioning this? Because if you're kind of ahead of the game, probably you'll anticipate that this is what he's going to say after this is done. He's going to say, well, there's nature too, and nature has all kinds of stuff in it that is very impressive in terms of the inner workings and complexity and function that those natural objects display. Consider, for example, the eyes that you're using right now to use vision. The rods and cones and the biological components of the eye are extremely sophisticated. So if we think that a watch has to have a maker, doesn't there have to be something that makes nature? Because nature also exhibits all this purposiveness, function, and careful arrangement of very fine pieces and parts. Now, somebody might react to that claim, that analogy between the watchmaker and the watch, and nature and God, and they might say, well, I've never seen God create nature. You know, I haven't seen the act of creation by God of anything in nature, so maybe I don't really know if it had a maker. But here's where he's trying to block that type of objection. So he's anticipating the critic's objection, and he's saying that in the case of the watch, you already know it has a maker, and you don't really need to see anybody making it to still see the evident marks of design and architecture in the watch. So that's one factor that would not cause a person to doubt that the watch had a maker. You know, the way he puts that phrase, he says, nor would it weaken the conclusion that we had never seen a watch made. He says, does one man in a million know how these frames are made? Ignorance of this exalts our opinion of the unseen and unknown artist, but raises no doubt in our mind of the existence of such an artist at some former time and in some place or another. So that's one that wouldn't really throw you off of the basic intuition that it had to have. Notice that there's some type of flaw in the watch. The watch is flawed or defective. The watch has a flaw. So suppose this hypothetical example of a watch that you come across is a broken watch. So when you pick up the watch off the ground, wherever, it's not really working proper. You look at the second hand, maybe it's ticking back and forth like a broken school clock or something. So this is an ineffective watch that's not properly measuring time. Does that mean that it didn't necessarily have a creator, or maybe you're doubting it whether it had a creator if it's a little defective? Yet again, I think you follow me. No, that's not a real reason to doubt that it had a creator or a maker. Even if it had a flaw, it's still obviously the kind of object that was put together for the typical purpose, despite the fact that perhaps a few of the parts or pieces are incorrectly operating at this time. So once again, even when the purposive and functional, carefully crafted object exhibits a flaw or some flaws, the evidence of it having been designed for a purpose is still there, and thus we can conclude that it had a maker even in the presence of having such flaws. Like a broken watch isn't the sort of thing that makes you question whether it really had a creator in the first place, that had intelligence. And so the same thing is going to be used as a way of preventing objections against the argument for God that he's making. Suppose that someone points out, oh, you say, you know, watchmaker creates the watch and God is the author of nature. But what about the fact that in nature, sometimes things are naturally defective, like some congenital birth defects, people born blind, um, people born with strange deformities or mutations or whatever, does that mean that it's not necessarily made by God, because that's a flaw in the organism in terms of its ideal function? And he would say, no, that's absurd to say that, because the same would be rejected in case of the watch. Okay, now a third reason that no one would doubt the watch had a maker is suppose that you don't know how it works. You don't know how the watch works. Point here is that you don't really need to know all the details of exactly how it works to know that it had an intelligent creator. I mean, like this computer that you're watching this lecture on, for example, do you really know all the details of how these computers work? I mean, some of us might, if you really focus on that as your topic, like you're a computer science person or you're an engineering person, so you know how chips and like electronics work and all of that. But for the most part, most of us just use these items of technology, and we're not fully informed or aware of the precise details of how they work. Even with a watch, like his example, I mean, I'm wearing this watch. This is a digital clock face, and I use it to keep time and other things, but I couldn't really dish on the details of how they work on the inside, what's going on under the hood. It's kind of like a car. I mean, some people know everything about how cars work, and other people just leave that to mechanics and stuff because they just don't have the time or the interest. I'm sort of that way. I mean, I know there's an internal combustion engine, and I know the basics of how like machines work, but I couldn't really tell you the precise mechanism of the car. Nonetheless, even not knowing those details, I still know it had to have a creator, because it's something that evidently has carefully arranged parts that performs a function. So not knowing how the watch works is no good reason to doubt that it had a maker. Even if it has a flaw, that's not a reason to doubt it. And even if you've not seen it being made, that's not a good reason to doubt it. And then one more, and that's the last one I'll just talk about while we're on the topic, is that nobody would think that the watch came about randomly. So what I wrote there, if you can read it, it says, nobody would say that the watch came about randomly, like through chance or through luck. So this is not a viable alternative to saying the watch had a creator, suggesting the possibility that nobody created it, and maybe it just came together through some chance events that happened randomly. Like, would anybody think that maybe a hurricane blew through and a volcano erupted, and it just kicked up all this magma in the air, and the wind currents that were traveling so fast just kicked up all these raw materials, and somehow, just by pure random chance, a watch was fused out of those elements and was a byproduct just sitting on the ground after these unguided, unconscious processes generated the watch. Nobody would think so, right? I mean, it's impossible for a watch that tells time, that has these carefully adjusted parts, to come about except for the activity of an intelligence that was doing it to create it for that purpose. The randomness of nature would have never produced a watch. Nobody would think that that is a different way of explaining how it came to exist. Okay, so I erase this, and now we kind of get to the end of his argument, the conclusion. So he's been setting us up for this last part, and I think you know what he's going to say. He says this is now going to be like an analogy. There are things in nature that also have purpose, function, and careful inner working of parts. And those things would, just as much as the watch, have to have a what? An intelligent designer. But of course, in the case of nature, the only possible intelligent designer has to be something that could be a creator of nature, something that is outside of nature, supernatural. So this supernatural creator of nature is basically God. And according to his argument, you have to assume that there's God, because how else could these very detailed things in life exist that are in nature? So for example, he gives the case of the eye. The eye, which uses to conduct vision, is a very impressive object, perhaps much more impressive than the most sophisticated camera that a man or a woman could create. And if the camera is something that's evidently made by intelligence because it can produce images, then the eye, just as much or even more so, would have to have the same origin lying with an intelligent designer. So the analogy is that the eye is kind of like the watch. The eye and other things in nature with a purpose or function must also have an intelligent designer, and that is God. Okay, now let me read the words of the author as he, brings this analogy home. He says here on page 33, every indication of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater and more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. I mean that the design of nature surpasses the design of art in the complexity, subtlety, and curiosity of the mechanism. And still more, if possible, do they go beyond them in number and variety. Yet, in many cases, they are not less evidently mechanical, not less evidently contrived, not less evidently accommodated to their goal or suited to their office than the most perfect productions of human ingenuity. I know no better method of introducing so large a subject than that of comparing a single thing with a single thing, an eye, for example, with the telescope. As far as the examination of the instrument goes, there is precisely the same proof that the eye was made for vision as there is that the telescope was made for assisting vision. They are made upon the same principles, both being adjusted to the laws by which the transmission and reflection of rays of light are regulated. And so he continues to describe, all the amazing sophistication and complexity of the parts of the eye, which, as he's arguing, exceed the sophistication and complexity of the parts that we see in any man-made object. Now, did he need to only refer to the eye? No, he could have used any other example of a thing in nature that serves a function, like what about the wings of a bird, or the echolocation of bats or aquatic mammals, or the ears that can hear, the nose that can smell, the tongue that can taste. So there's so many body parts and other features of living things and natural systems that conduce to a purpose or a function which allows those organisms to thrive and to survive in their environment. So he says, what about that? How is that any different from the watch? A person who comes across a watch cannot deny that it has an intelligent creator. So how can one consistently say that things in nature don't have an intelligent creator when they exhibit even more impressive aspects of design, function, and inner workings of like a mechanical nature? So that's an argument analogy, and I'll close the discussion for the moment with this presentation of the analogy. So whenever an analogy is stated, some of you guys have learned about those in SATs and stuff, a person says this is to that, like A is to B as C is to D. So let's see if you can complete this analogy. The watch is to the watchmaker as what is to what? Or do you prefer it the other way? The watchmaker is to the watch as what is to what? The relation that the watchmaker stands in to the watch is analogous to the relation that what stands into what? You can tell me in the chat. Yeah, so the watch stands to God. Sorry, the watch stands to the watchmaker as nature stands to God. Exactly. Yeah, so like we are the watchmakers of watches and other items of human ingenuity and industry. And God is the architect, the author, the so-called watchmaker of the works of nature. So he thinks that appreciating the principle seen in the watch example and then extending that to the works of nature will get to the conclusion that God is the creator. And that's the reason that these things in nature exist, that carry out function and that have purpose. Okay, so any kind of questions about that one? Is that kind of at least making some decent sense to you guys? My whole job is to just present these arguments to you and to hope that I'm giving you the at least clearest understanding I can. Of course, it's something you can reinforce by going back to the text reading again or scanning your notes. But that's the big picture here on this argument, okay? So, make sense? Let me know if you don't have. Okay, good, thanks. So we've now studied and learned about three. These are three major arguments for God's existence that have been, discussed much throughout history. The ontological, the cosmological, and this is the design argument. Sometimes, all this logical stuff, this is sometimes called the teleological argument, which means the argument from the purpose of the thing or the function of the thing. The telos of something is its function or its end, as they say in the old Aristotelian works of Aristotle. So whether you call it the argument from design or the teleological argument, this is another member, we could call it the third member of the big three: ontological, cosmological, teleological. But just as before, when we looked at objections to the ontological argument, there are definitely objections to both of the last two, the cosmological and the design argument. So now the goal is to go into those objections by looking at the work of Ernest Nagel. So as we move through our syllabus, the next author in the list is Ernest Nagel. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Okay, so Ernest Nagel is he's an important 20th century American philosopher. He was originally born in Czech Republic, but he immigrated to America as a very young child and became a U.S. citizen. He lived in New York. He taught at Columbia for most of his life. That's also where he got his bachelor's degree and his PhD. So then he became a professor there for most of his life. He lived from 1901 until 1985. And in 1959, he wrote a book which contains this little section that is included in our anthology. And it's just called, Does God Exist? Okay, so Does God Exist by Ernest Nagel from 1959. Now, Nagel himself is not a believer. He's an atheist. So by definition of the term atheism, that means he's not convinced by any of the arguments that God exists. He doesn't believe in the existence of God, but he has critical objections to state to all these various famous arguments for God's existence. And so he kind of takes us on a tour through what the big problems are that he sees anyway. And some others have pointed these problems out too, but what are the sort of conceptual criticisms and arguments, objections that can be given against these big arguments for God's existence? So he takes them on one by one. The first argument for God's existence that he provides criticism of is the cosmological argument that we kind of just finished our discussion of at the beginning of today's meeting. So I'm going to just provide for you his criticisms, and we'll discuss it as like problems with the cosmological argument. Okay, so that's author, title, and dates. Now I'm erasing that. And I'm just going to provide the problems with the cosmological argument according to Nagel. Now, just one word before I talk about those problems, because the first thing he does is actually he summarizes the argument itself. Kind of like how Ganilo did at the beginning of his discussion of the ontological argument. He first summarized it, and then he gave the criticism. So Nagel does that here as well. And I think that his summary of it is good and very brief. So on page 34, he says, one of the oldest arguments for theism is the cosmological argument, also known as the argument from first cause. Briefly put, the argument goes like this. So here's his brief summary. Every event must have a cause. So an event A must have as cause some event B, which must have as cause some event C. This is just a little diagram of that, and so on. But if there is no end to this backward sequence of causes, that's the infinity symbol, then the progress of the sequence would be infinite. And in the opinion of those who make the argument, an infinite sequence of events is impossible and absurd. So that can't be. That means there must be a first cause, and the first cause is God, the creator of everything and the initiator of the universe. Okay, so that's a summary of the argument. Now, from there, he provides his criticisms. And what are these problems? Okay, so the first problem he mentions briefly is is it really true that everything has to have a cause? He questions that assumption of the argument right away. So does everything have to have a cause? And I'm stating it as a question, but it's really laid out as an assertion. Basically, the implication is perhaps not. Perhaps some things just don't have to have a cause. So the argument asserts that the universe that we're a part of is something that has to have a cause. And that's what leads to the conclusion that it must be God which is that cause. It can't be something contingent. But you would really cut the legs out from the argument if you said, wait, stop right there. I don't know if I even agree with the first premise that everything has to have a cause. Like, maybe there are some things that just don't have to have a cause. Like, think about it this way. You could argue that particular things have to have a cause, like objects and events, like particular things, me and you, we have to have a cause, our parents and stuff like that. The cause of your automobile is the factory assembly process that, produced it and shipped it to wherever lot that you bought it from. But you might argue that the whole universe containing everything is something that's different from particular things, and it doesn't have to have a cause. So one issue with the argument is its assumption that everything has to have a cause, which is supposed to give us the idea that the universe has to have one. But some might disagree and say, I'm not 100% convinced that everything has to have a cause. Now, beyond that, though, there's other problems. Suppose that you agree, though, that everything has to have a cause. Okay, so that's one point. But even if you think everything has to have a cause, what do you think could be pointed out as an inconsistency in where the argument goes next? If everything has to have a cause, the universe has to have a cause, then why doesn't what have to have a cause, according to perhaps a critic of this argument? What do you think I'm fishing around for here? Someone could make the claim that it's inconsistent to say everything has to have a cause, but not what? If everything has to have a cause, then wouldn't also God have to have a cause? Yes, that's right. So if everything has to have a cause, wouldn't God have to have one? Then why doesn't God have to have a cause? Okay, so I wrote, if everything must have a cause, then why doesn't God have to have a cause? One could argue that that is inconsistent, that the argument switches it up after it says everything has to have a cause, so definitely the universe has to have one. But only thing is, God does not have to have a cause. Doesn't that sound inconsistent? On the one hand, you're saying everything has to have a cause, but God does not have a cause. So it's sort of like the intuition that everything has to have a cause is insisted upon. Statements don't really fit together. Let me write them here. Statement number 1, everything has a cause. Statement number 2, God has no cause. These two things seem to be in tension with each other. They seem to straight contradict each other. Sometimes I've seen that diagram by 2 arrows pointing towards each other. These things contradict. They can't both be true. If everything has a cause, then so does God. But if God has no cause, then everything doesn't need to have a cause. So it seems like the argument kind of wants to have it both ways, simultaneously to assert that everything must have a cause, but also to deny that in the case of God that this principle applies to him. Okay, now another problem on top of these two here is that suppose that there could be something with no cause, like God is being suggested to be. If there could be something with no cause, then why couldn't just what be uncaused instead of just God? What do you think I'm asking? So if there could be things with no cause, then why not simply assume that this thing is the thing that is uncaused and is the necessary being? Yeah, the universe itself. So I'll put this here because they kind of go in that order. The third problem is if there can be things with no cause, if some things can have no cause, like they say God, then why can't the universe have no cause? And then finally, last issue here, last little problem before we close the meeting. He asks the question, is an infinite regress really impossible? Maybe it is not impossible. And that would undermine the argument also. So perhaps an infinite regress is not impossible. So perhaps an infinite regress is not impossible. The argument says that the universe has to have a cause, but whatever caused it can't be contingent, because that would just set us off asking for another cause that it has, and on and on and on to infinity. And if an infinite regress is impossible, that means there has to be this initial cause that's not contingent. But you could undermine the whole argument if you deny that that an infinite regress is impossible. Perhaps it is, after all, possible for there to be an infinite sequence of causes going back forever. The point is made that we actually do have a coherent conception of actual infinity and an infinite series through mathematics and set theory and even geometry. Take, for example, 2 points that lie on a line. How many points are there in between the 2 points on the line segment? Well, let's take the 2 endpoints, A and B. There's going to be a midpoint in between A and B, call it M. And how many points are there between A and M? Well, we could generate infinitely many more. There's a midpoint between A and M. There's a midpoint between that midpoint. And we could never exhaust the set of points that lie along even the 2 smallest intervals of the geometric line. So there seem to be just as many members in a subset of the line in terms of points as there are members in the entire line segment. Also with numeric quantities. Between 2 values like 0 and 1, there are infinitely many numerals. Take 0.5 as an intermediate point between 0 and 1, the 2 integers. There's also a midpoint between 0 and 0.5, which is 0.25, and a midpoint between 0 and 0.25, 0.125. And we could continue to split this in half to an infinite degree, because we could always generate a new value by expanding the decimal position over and adding further digits. So it seems like there's an inexhaustible number of numbers, even in between the 2 smallest segments on the number line. Therefore, couldn't the timeline of universe's history be infinitely dense going into the past as well? A set of temporal points that cannot be exhausted and is infinitely dense. So anyway, those are just some thoughts to close the meeting with. I know we have more to say on this, so on Monday's meeting we'll come back to this. I'll summarize and finish the work of Nagel, and then we'll go ahead and talk about Blaise Pascal and W.K. Clifford. So just over the weekend, if you have a chance, try to read, finish up with Nagel if you haven't, and read the work of Blaise Pascal, The Wager, and W.K. Clifford, The Ethics of Belief. And that'll be our topic on Monday. And then next week, we'll also start looking at the first paper prompts, but I'm not going to distribute them until midweek next week. Okay, guys. So thanks so much for all of your hard work and attendance. I appreciate your contributions today. Have a great day and a good weekend, and I will see you guys on Monday then. Okay? Thanks again. Bye-bye.